We showed you the image of the top 25, the Associated Press preseason top 25. Ralph Russo, the Associated Press, joins us for some nuggets about today and also the top 25 in general. Ralph, thanks for your time. I think looking at 1 through 25, with an exception of one could be up 1 or 2, it looked like it all kind of came together pretty easily. Do you feel like that's the case?
Yeah, the weird thing that's happened with the preseason poll, and I've been handling the poll in some way, shape, or form for about 20 years now. All the way too earlies, and then the way earlies, and then the pre-spring practice, post-spring practice, post-spring portal top 25s. The computer rankings that come out in the summer that put everything together. There's so much ranking of teams that, voters are not going to be immune to that. I mean, it's not like we have these people living in boxes, like where they can't see any of this stuff. And I will admit, I think some of our voters, and I would even encourage that, look at the SP Plus, FPI, look at those things, because I think the computer formulas generally give you some idea. In other words, if you're going to be taking in a lot of information, I think it's going to guide you to a spot where, unfortunately, I think for us, coming out as the last poll, you end up building a little bit of a group think because there's been so much ranking, so that by the time it does hit, it's never going to be a big surprise who's in it and the teams that are lining up that way, because I think you kind of coalesce around all this vat of information that's been building up for 6 or 8 months since the national championship game was played.
Ralph, in your personal voting of it, do you have anything that you thought, at least if it was the Ralph Russo poll, since you're with the AP, that would have been that was interesting that the rest of the voters went this way?
Yeah, listen, I think people will, because first of all, just to make it clear, I don't vote, right? We pick the voters, we count them up, we administer the poll here at the AP, but we being AP employees do not vote. So, listen, I'm not going to get on Twitter and flame the voters like some people will, right? But I will look at the poll with a critical eye, just like fans do. I will look through and go, I'm not sure if I'm as into Missouri as everybody else is into, and they're number 11. And boy, even Oregon at number 3, I don't know if I would have been that high on Oregon. So I do the same thing that you do, right? I will move some teams around in my mind. I will kind of go boy, Miami, I've been getting burned by Miami a lot over the last few years. I think I might want to see them do that before I totally buy into them. And sometimes I'll actually even sketch out a poll. So, I don't know if anything jumps out that's really weird. Usually at the bottom of the poll, those teams tend to be interchangeable anyway. And if I told you I would not have ranked USC, I don't know if that's an indictment on the voters. If I would not have, I don't think I would have ranked NC State. That's not necessarily an indictment on the voters. But again, if I'm looking at where I might be higher than others on folks, again, I don't know if I'm quite as high on Missouri coming into this year. I might have knocked the Ducks down a couple of spots. But I would also say, once you get into that game, then you actually have to say, well, who are you moving up, right? And would I be comfortable moving up Alabama? I don't know. With the new coach there, no Saban, maybe I might have had Ole Miss ahead of Alabama, though that might be a prisoner of the moment. So, let's put it this way. When I do that game, I end up being happy that I'm not the one actually doing the ranking.
Yeah, no, I understand that completely, Ralph. There were some others receiving votes, as always, included at the bottom of the poll. Louisville led that by a pretty large margin, knocking on that door of the top 25 preseason. But no G5 love, Ralph. I know some of that's been shaken up, like SMU doesn't count anymore because they're now in the ACC. But do you feel like there's any G5 disrespect, or is that just, the natural way the poll played out? And if there was some G5 love to be given, where would you start?
So I will say this. It stood out this year because now we're only down to a P4 and there was only 4 conferences represented. So we are seeing the consolidation of power the consolidation of power that has played out over the last couple of years in the boardroom, right with conference realignment, it showed up in the poll. I mean, we knew it was coming, but it becomes pretty stark when you see 8 SEC teams, 6 Big Ten teams. 8 of the 10 teams in the top 10 are Big Ten and SEC. Again, you kind of know it's coming, but it really shows itself up in the poll. As far as the G5, so traditionally, even when we had a little more parity and more conferences that sort of that got in there, G5 teams tend to be a little underrepresented in the preseason poll. Usually you get 1 or 2, and you're right, SMU, they're not in this rankings, but maybe if they had remained in the ACC, I could have seen them get a little love. Usually you end up with 1 or 2, but you almost always get a few more as the season goes on. I think the general feeling with the G5 is voters tend to want to see those teams do it, right? I think you have a little more volatility in those leagues, and you see teams kind of come from the middle of the pack and surge ahead. So what you end up getting is and of course, Cincinnati's gone, UCF's gone, some of these teams that have sort of built up reputations or had good runs, they're now in power conferences. So that being the case as well, Boise was number 1 of the others receiving votes in the G5. In other words, if you're looking at it like a playoff ranking, what's the first G5 team? It was Boise. I think Memphis is probably one to keep an eye on. I know Liberty got some love, but man, again, they're not playing any P5 Power 4 teams. So I'm a little more skeptical of giving them that ranking. But I think Memphis and Boise are the 2 that come to mind for me as okay, I'm going to probably keep a keen eye on them heading into the season.
So basically, in other words, if you're a group of 5 and any of the ones you just brought up that were getting some votes, you don't get the benefit of the doubt until you show there's no doubt?
I do. I think that's always kind of been the case. Now, again, it's changed in 20 years. I think what's happened is when Boise was constantly every year knocking out good seasons, they would appear in the preseason top 25. And I think Cincinnati over a period of time built up some credibility, UCF. So I think what happens now with the G5 is you kind of look around to the G5 landscape and you say, well, Boise hasn't even, they didn't even win the Mountain West last year. And Tulane had a nice run, but their coach is gone, and look what the transfer portal's done to them. So I think that what you lack is in the G5, and this is not just in the poll, but I think it really is the story of G5 football is who are going to be the next teams that sort of surge into perennial contenders. Boise's already sort of been there, and they're always going to get respect. But is Memphis now going to be that team that starts knocking out big seasons perennially? Is it UTSA? If we look toward the Sun Belt, Coastal had a nice little run, and they're kind of fading off now. Appalachian State's generally been pretty good. So I just think that what we lack is what we had 20 years ago, which is those G5 teams or those non-BCS teams at the time, where you could sort of circle them and say, I know that team's going to be good because they've done it for 4 or 5 years, and you just don't see those 4 or 5 runs as much over the last few years. And the teams that did put together those runs, they're gone. They're in power conferences now.
How many voters do you have? I know I could look at the old first place votes. But how many are there, Ralph?
So there are 62 for the preseason poll this year, and it usually fluctuates between 60, 61, 64. There's a couple of different ways, sort of that we come up with the number of voters. But generally will fluctuate. Generally, it will be around 62 to 64, and this year's preseason poll at 62.
Do they do this online?
Yeah, it's so. This tells you how long I've been doing it, and this goes back. This goes back before I was in this position, but I worked at the AP. I mean, when I first started at the AP a long, long time ago, guys, the voters would either call into the desk and just dictate their poll to somebody who picked up the phone. And I was often one of the people who picked up the phone and would take the poll, or they would fax in a poll to be entered. At a certain point, email became vogue, so that was helpful, right? People would email their polls. But right now, and really over the last, oh God, time moves fast. I want to say over the last like 7 or 8 years, maybe more like 10, there's an online dashboard, kind of works like an app, and voters can just pop themselves on there and drop downs and submit a poll pretty easily. So yes, technology, thank goodness, technology has advanced enough so that we're no longer taking poll phone calls at 4 a.m.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Thank you, man. Appreciate your time, Ralph. I know it's been a busy day for you to get it set up and all the questions that people have. Thanks for giving us some answers. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, guys. Thank you.
Ralph Russo, Associated Press, with us. One nugget from Brett McMurphy. And then Dan Hope on Ohio State, ranked number 2 in the expectations there, demands there. Either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. Since 2004, every national champion ranked among the AP preseason top 7, other than 2013 FSU, they started 11, and 2010 Auburn, they started 22nd, have won the national title. So Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Notre Dame are in that trend. The exceptions are Jameis Winston and Cam Newton. And there's a reason for that, because they were once-in-a-lifetime type guys.
Yeah, it's also never, been a situation where there's been a 12-team playoff. So we'll see if that holds or not. But I do think it was quite interesting to see the conference numbers this year with the realignment now made official. 9 SEC teams, and then you had, what's interesting is if you count Notre Dame as an ACC team, which for all intents and purposes they sort of are, it's 5 Big 12, 5 ACC, 6 Big 10, and 9 SEC. So if you were to break them up, that's probably about how you would do it. I think maybe you'd have like the Big 12 or ACC perhaps with like one less because there'd be a G5, but with no G5s, it was all those 4 conferences, those Power 4 conferences, and split 9, 6, 5, 5 relatively closely compared to what kind of extreme opinions people seem to have on how the Big 10 and the SEC are going to dominate. 9 still, way more than the next best at 6, but just interesting to see that breakdown in this first preseason poll of this new realignment era. So, yeah, just thought that was
if you go back to the former conferences, like the Pac-12 would have had 4 this year. The largest fall, we got a break for Dan Hope. The largest fall, Washington not in the top 25 after what was a remarkable run. Of course, so many changes, coaching staff, players, eligibility, etc., with the Huskies.